Good morning. Hope you're having a good holiday weekend. I second the motion for gratefulness. That's an incredible accomplishment, 57 years. And I think we all, if we look around, find things to be grateful for. So much in this church that we ought to spend more time speaking of positively of what good is going on. Last week, I talked up Restore and how important that had become to me. And then I got to see this last Sunday night at our first Restore of the season, just an outpouring of this church at that event. And it really was a great kickoff night. We had over 80 people present, and I don't know if that means anything to you, but I'm telling you, I've preached for churches that are smaller than that, right? I mean, it was a healthy number to see there. We had the youth showed up in mass to help serve food, which was an incredible act of service we appreciate. We had a lot of volunteers from the congregation that showed up, some for the first time, and we appreciate that. We had Katie Sanders come and got to come up and share her story of some obstacles and struggles she's had in life and where she's seen God open doors and make healing possible, make a way forward possible, and that was amazing. And I think above all, we're grateful to God because we're starting all week long, got to hear contact from various people that were there and that were touched by what happened, and we're getting to see continued fruit develop from these simple acts of sharing the gospel and worshiping together. So I'm grateful for all that and for what God is doing, and hope we can all look for these opportunities to participate and to be grateful for the good that God is doing. I like to act when I don't mean act like as in drama, I'm not getting good at that, but I mean to take action. When I see a problem, it's very hard for me not to want to fix it. I want to do something about it. If I see an injustice, I want to right it. If I see an evil in the world, I want to fight it, right? If there's something out there that's bad, I want to go get it and stop it. I don't know if that's a unique part of my personality or if you can empathize with that, but it's hard for me to even be patient and wait. When I see something that needs righted, I want to go about righting it. Okay? I think a lot of us are that way. So when we look at the world and we see things that are not the way they're supposed to be, we see something in the world that we label as evil, and often correctly so. There is real evil in the world. There are real moral absolutes. There are really things wrong out there. We look at it, and if you're like me, your blood pressure gets up a little bit. You say, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do? How do we fight the evil in the world? But if you know anything about fighting, you know that if you don't put some thought into what you're fighting, you become part of the problem. The ready, fire, aim philosophy is not a great way to hit your target. In fact, you become part of the problem. If you just start swinging, throwing punches indiscriminately, you start to harm people who might be victims of the same problem you're trying to fight. So just getting revved up inside and say, we're going to go do something, you can actually make things worse. What we want to talk about from the book of Luke today, next week, for the Sundays in September, is we're going to take a few chapters out of Luke and see Jesus talking to people about how to address the real evil in the world, starting with the question, where does it come from? If we don't know our enemy a little bit, then we don't even know how to begin addressing the problem. Something's wrong out there, but it takes discernment to look and say, where does it come from? What's the real problem? We don't want to be like a poor doctor who just starts prescribing medicine for symptoms and never addresses the root cause. We want to know, what is the disease? What's really at the core of what's wrong, and how do we deal with that rather than just kind of dancing around the edges of the problem? Where does evil come from? And I don't even mean this in a grand philosophical way like cosmically, is evil from the devil? Is it some eternal or created thing? I'm not asking that question either. That's not the issue. I mean just in an immediate sense. What's the most immediate source of evil in the world? And that discussion for us will come from Mark, I think I said Luke earlier. It'll come from Mark, the 7th chapter. And in Mark chapter 7, we see a group of people who are fired up about something they see that is wrong in the world, and they want to do something about it. This group of people are known as the Pharisees. The Pharisees are a kind of subculture within Judaism in the first century, and they are pious, deeply religious people who want to preserve their way of life and feel like the world has been eating away at it. Okay? If that sounds familiar, again, I can empathize with that. And let me say that right up front. You can't understand this passage unless you can try to sympathize with the Pharisees. If you see them as mustache-twirling villains, again, you're missing the point of the story. They are deeply religious people, and they see a problem. It says, "Now when the Pharisees gathered to him," the him is Jesus, "and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed." Okay? So they see a problem in the world, and they want to do something about it. Now, I don't know about you. I'm in favor of good hygiene and whatnot. But when I look at the world, my first thought isn't, really, people ought to be washing their hands. You should. But that's not like my root problem. We've been camping this weekend out at Gore, Oklahoma. In fact, my wife and youngest son are still there, and I'll be heading back this afternoon. And little boys don't think about this sort of thing. When they come to eat the campground, they just come running, and you have to kind of, whoa, see that hose over there? Just spray that down, and then you can touch food. And I don't think that through. I'm in favor of good hygiene. I'm in favor of cleanliness. But it's not something as simple as that's at stake in this story. Why does this bother the Pharisees? Why are they not just disturbed in an icky way, but like provoked by the fact that the disciples of Jesus had unwashed hands? They didn't have clean hands. What Mark is going to do, and this is great for us because Mark is an author to a Gentile audience. And so quite often, 3 times in this story alone, Mark will interrupt the story and give you a little parenthetical statement for us non-Jewish folks to say, and here's why that matters, and explain something to us. So in verses 3 through 4, he does the explanation. He says, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches." Okay. So this is just a short description Mark is offering his Gentile audience. You imagine you're a Roman reader picking up Mark's gospel, and you would feel like we do. Why are these people upset about cleanliness? Why is that the issue of the moment? Why are people mad about that? And Mark says it's part of who they are. This is something, it's not just a family custom. He says, this is what the Pharisees and all the Jews do. This is what it means to be Jewish in their sense, in their eyes. This was the tradition that they had been handed by their forefathers. This is what their parents had taught them. This was the right way to do things. The Pharisees in particular, if we were to dive a little deeper, were passionate about preserving their identity and their way of life. They saw the Jewish way of life being eaten away by Greek culture, by Roman culture, by all the things going on in the world, by those Gentiles that they had sworn to fight against. See the common thing there? They wanted to fight evil in the world, and the evil had a name. It was the other people. It was the Gentiles. It was the Greeks. It was the Romans. And so anything that helps us remember we are us and they are them became not just about cleanliness, it became about morality. It became about who we are. Which side are you on? And one of the things that they used as kind of a distinguishing feature was Gentiles are dirty. We're clean. And then they took that to kind of an elaborate place that we find odd, but just, again, try to sympathize with them. There were rules in the Old Testament for how to be clean versus unclean when you entered the tabernacle, when you entered the temple. The Pharisees went one step further, and Mark even hints at it. He says they applied this when you came home from the marketplace. You come home from Walmart, you wash your hands. Come to think of it, not a terrible idea. But you come from the marketplace, you wash your hands. You got a cup, you wash it. You sit on a couch, you wash it. Like everything you touch. They wanted their whole life to have the cleanliness of the temple. They might live 100 miles from the temple, but they wanted to be able to walk out their front door and step into the temple and say, this is who we are. We're God's people. We're not like those folks. We're these folks. So, in a very real way, they identified an evil in the world and went about fighting it. This isn't just about hygiene. This is about who they were as God's people. They said, this is what defines us. We aren't like them. We need to be like us. And so they see the disciples of Jesus, a great teacher of the Jewish people, clearly Jewish, his disciples clearly Jewish, and yet they're not doing it the way that the Jewish people did it according to their traditions. You're acting like them. You're acting like the unwashed Gentiles. You're not doing it the way we do it. You're participating in the slow erosion of our values. So they saw an evil, and they went about fighting it. And they look at the disciples, and they say, these guys aren't doing it right. Jesus responds to them very sharply. He actually quotes from the Old Testament. Okay? And don't miss the irony there. You're a Pharisee and you're thinking, I am here fighting on behalf of God's law and the Scriptures and our identity. And Jesus says, have you read it? Because here's something that same book said about us. Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandments of God and hold to the tradition of men. What is he telling them? He said, when you were reading the Old Testament, when you were reading about cleanliness and washing your hands, you should have read the rest of it. Because the prophets made a very big point of telling you that while all those things are well and good, lip service won't get it done. That there's something more to being God's people than these outward, obvious tokens of their identity. Or to say it another way, fighting evils without does not address the problem within. He doesn't even say the Pharisees were necessarily wrong. Did you catch that? He doesn't say no one should wash their hands. I'm glad he doesn't say that. It would be a confusing world to live in. He's not against it. He's not opposed to what they're doing. He says, but the problem is, you tried to identify an evil in the world, and you thought you found it, and you pointed and said, there's the enemy. It's these guys who don't wash their hands. He says, but Isaiah said, the enemies that we're supposed to be looking for lurk within ourselves. It's the inner man that has both the highest heights of human nature and the lowest lows. If you're looking for what's wrong in the world, Isaiah said, it's inside of you. That's the closest enemy to address. He goes further, and I don't know, he had a good breakfast that morning because he takes a sharp stick and just kind of starts poking him. He says, in fact, you do this quite a lot. He says, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. He says, not only are you not listening to Isaiah when he says, look at your inward man, he says, you're working overtime. You have found ways to take your traditional things, these things that you think are important, that you think you care about, and even place them above the things God actually told you should define you. You could leave that vague, but again, he had a good breakfast. And so he's going to start naming examples. In verses 11, skipped a verse. Verses 10, he says, do you remember this bit when Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die? He says, do you remember the Old Testament when there was this basic commandment to honor your father and mother? Keep it in context a minute. What had they just been discussing? Why did Mark tell us that they thought it was important to wash their hands? He said, because this is the tradition of our elders and our parents. In their mind, one of the ways you honored your parents was by doing the things they had taught you. The rituals, the hand washing, the cup washing, you did it like Mama did it. That was the way you honored them. Jesus said, remember that commandment when Moses said, honor your father and mother? Do you remember that? He said, have you noticed how sometimes you guys don't do that? And then he names it in verses 11 through 13. But you say, if a man tells his father or mother, whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, and then he said, I don't know what Corban is, and that's all right. Mark knows you don't know what Corban is, and so he puts a parenthesis there, and he tells you, here's what that means. He says, that is given to God. The word Corban is a Hebrew word. It's used like 40 times in the book of Leviticus. And it's a word that means something that was dedicated to God. When you're getting ready to make a sacrifice, you might have 10 lamb, okay? And you take one of them and you say, this is the one we're going to sacrifice. This one is Corban. This one has been dedicated to God. This is his. And so you don't have that one for dinner. That one has been set aside. It belongs to God. With me so far? That's the meaning of the word Corban. Well, they had discovered kind of a accounting loophole that they found, isn't everything I've got given to God? Doesn't everything I have belong to God? Isn't it all Corban? And so when it came time to take care of Mom and Dad, and they say, hey, you know, we can't work anymore. There's not really Social Security in the first century Jewish world. You needed to take care of your elderly parents in a very obvious way, or they were going to starve. And they would say, I'd like to take care of you, Mom and Dad, but you know, everything I have belongs to God. You don't want me to cheat God, do you? Whatever you would have gained from me is Corban. Then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you've handed down. He said, you found a way to interpret the law of God in a way that prevents you from keeping the law of God. You interpreted one of the particulars in a way that violates the 10 Commandments, like not one of the obscure rules hidden somewhere deep in Leviticus. He says it's one of the 10. It's one of the building blocks of our civilization. It's the reason you're mad about hand washing. He says, you found a way to kind of work around that and pretend to be pious while ignoring what God actually said. Mark wants us to learn the word Corban. I want you to learn another word today. It's a fun word. Casuistry. Casuistry is, by definition, the use of clever but unsound reasoning, especially in relation to moral questions. It's, to put it nicely, and I'm sorry to Barry and any other attorneys in the room, casuistry is what you pay your attorney for. Okay. When you're in a courtroom and you're guilty, what you pay the attorney for is, can you find a way that I'm not? Can you find like a loophole somewhere in there where it looks like I did what I was supposed to do and I'm actually off the hook? I'm sorry, attorneys, I'm just the worst. But that's kind of the thinking of it. Know who's experts in casuistry? Children. They are experts. Had a friend tell me this story. The mother had told the boy, and the true story happened in their home. The mother had told the boy, would you go to your room and run the vacuum? And she hears the vacuum going down the hall, and it just going and going and going. And finally, she walks down the hall, opens the door. He's laying in bed, and the vacuum is plugged in and on. Okay? Casuistry. Did he run the vacuum? Well, Your Honor, technically, yes. Yeah, I mean, technically, he'd done exactly what he'd been told to do. Had he obeyed his mother? Not at all. See the difference? And this is what we tend to do. And it's one of the rare cases where your knowledge of the Bible becomes a problem. Because the more you know about the book, the more you can think, well, but isn't there that one verse that kind of hints that maybe it's okay to do the thing that I want to do in the first place? And you find ways to just work around the more obvious things that God said. If you're picking out things in the Old Testament you're supposed to do, probably the 10 Commandments is where you want to start. It's not a bad starting place. They found a way to get around one of the 10 Commandments by an obscure accounting loophole. And then at the end of the verse, don't miss this bit, and many such things you do. He gave them one example to kind of call their attention to something glaring. But I don't want you to read this story and think that the story is about, this is not a story about washing hands. It kind of is, but it's not. It's not a story about accounting and whether money is dedicated to God or not. It kind of is, but it's not. It's not even exactly about what foods are clean or not. He's going to get to that in a second. It kind of is, but it's not. He says the issue is the way you are trying to obey God is by obeying your own desires first. You decide what you want to do, and then you go to the text and you try to find it. And many such things you do. Who made them act this way? What was the source of evil in the world? The Gentiles didn't make them dishonor their parents. The unwashed masses didn't make them love their father and mother any less. Where did that come from? It came from inside their own heart. Neither tradition nor law can protect you from your motives. Folks, if ever there was a law that could have taught us righteousness, if ever there was a law that could have made us better, it was the law of Moses. If ever there was a law that could really make you who you ought to be, it'd be the one God gave Moses at the top of Mount Sinai. But what the Bible shows us over and over again is that there's no set of rules that you can put in place that'll touch your motives if those are wrong to begin with. The enemy lurks within. Hear me, all of you, he says, and understand there is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him. You're worried about the erosion of Jewish values and we're becoming too much like the Greeks and too much like the Romans. He says that's not where the problem is coming from. The Romans aren't the problem. The people who have stopped being people of God will find that enemy within themselves. Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach and is expelled? He says, do you think the food is the issue? Do you think God sent Moses the law so he could regulate your food? Do you think that was the point of it all? That up in heaven there is a God who is deeply concerned above all things with your diet. He says every time he was talking about that, he was really talking about something else. He was trying to change the way you live. And yeah, he did give rules about food. He gave rules about lots of stuff. He says, but it was supposed to reach into your heart. And you found a way to hold it all at arm's distance and even managed to keep most of the rules while ignoring the parts that were supposed to get to your heart. He says, make sure you're looking at the right thing here. What comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. You want to fight evil in the world? You don't have to go looking for it. Every wrong you've ever done started inside of you. No one made you do that. There are circumstances that influenced it. There are people that may have nudged you in a direction. There are forces at work in the universe that are not on your side, and I believe all that. But at the end of the day, we do the things we want to do. And there's quite a lot inside of us that just doesn't want to do what God tells us. That wants to be selfish, that wants to be pleasured, that wants the easy things in life rather than the hard. Those things aren't somebody else. That's not the culture getting to us. That's not social media influencing us. That's not the political system. That's us. And the way I know it's not those things is because those things come and go. Countries rise and fall. Societies crumble. But you know what stays the same? What lurks in the human heart. It's the reason we can read a 2,000-year-old book and feel like it's talking to us today. Because what's inside is still there. if you want to fight evil, if you're serious, stop turning your action and your motivation towards the enemies you see out there. Stop trying to look for blame and people to assign guilt to. And instead, remember, the one person you can change is you. The one evil you can fight every single day is what's inside of you. God has given you the resources to wage that battle within. And that's the one we should be fighting. Jesus knew this. And as I kind of try to wrap this up and bring it home, don't forget that Jesus understood this. Jesus knew where the enemy was, and he came with a cross, not a sword. If the enemy's out there, I need some weapons to go get them. How do you reach the enemy in here? Jesus showed us a way. He went to the cross. He accepted struggle. He accepted hardship. He accepted the consequences of the evil that lurks inside of us. He took that on himself because that's the enemy we're supposed to be fighting anyway. And for what it's worth, he won. The enemy that exists in your heart, I know it's there, it's in mine. It has already been defeated. It was defeated that day on a cross. And when he woke up and rose again on the third day, he signaled its victory. If you would participate in the victory of God over the true enemy within, then we would call on you to respond to the gospel in faith and in participation in what God has done, to put to death the enemy within and let God raise up a new creature. We're going to stand and sing today. I know I've got one person interested in responding. If you would like to participate in the gospel in that way, won't you come forward as we stand and as we sing?